Okay, talking about Maimonides, what I propose to do in this hour over the next few weeks is to go through as much of Maimonides' laws of tshuva as possible. Tshuva is sometimes translated as repentance, but that's not a wrong translation, as we will see. This is preparation for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. It is the way we repair mistakes that have been made, and we are going to look at his text in translation. I will go through it piece by piece. Today, I'd like to start with an introduction to who Maimonides was, what kind of scholar he was, what kind of thinker he was, what his place was in Jewish history, Jewish thought, and then tomorrow we'll start with the actual text. I remember when I was in high school about 103 years ago, they had a list of 12 people in the history of the world, each of whom knew everything there was to know in his culture, like Aristotle. Maimonides was one of the 12. He lived in Spain and then in Egypt. He had visited Eretz Israel. And he mastered everything in medieval Arabic culture, including their works on their own works on philosophy and the translations of Aristotle and Plato into Arabic, which were plentiful at that time, and history and other religions and whatever there was to mathematics, astronomy, whatever there was to know, he knew. Now, when a secular historian says that, for him, that's a whole universe. But he hasn't got a clue what it means to master all of the Jewish information. Maimonides was a consummate master of all the Jewish information that was available at his time. Not only did he know it all, but he understood it in an extremely profound way. And he had an extremely original, revolutionary way of dealing with it. Maimonides was the first Jewish author to create a code of Jewish law. Before that, there were no codes of law, simply instructions. This is what you should do. The Mishnah is not a code of law in that sense. The Talmud is certainly not a code of law in that sense. Gaonim did not produce codes of law. He was the first one to produce a code, and in fact, it was very controversial. Many people opposed him. He simply said, this is what the Torah wants you to do. He didn't give any sources. He didn't give any proofs. He simply codified laws. He reorganized all of Jewish law into 14 categories, and the categories were broken down into separate books of separate subjects, and then into separate paragraphs of individual laws. Organization is entirely his own. There's nothing like that organization in the Talmud or the Midrash or any earlier Jewish sources. Not only that, but he included not only the practical laws, the laws that people were actually practicing in the 11th century, but all the laws that will be practiced at the time of the Messiah. That was the principle by which the Mishnah Torah was written, which means all the laws of sacrifices, the temple, the land of Israel, agricultural laws, laws of purity, which were not practiced, and which prior commentators tended to skip or deal with lightly because they weren't practically applicable. Maimonides took responsibility for the entire corpus. Now, before he wrote the Mishnah Torah, he wrote a commentary on the Mishnah. Commentary on the Mishnah is very extensive. It was written in Arabic. Those who wrote Jewish works, Torah works in Arabic, were writing for a population who would find reading in Hebrew difficult, and whose knowledge of Jewish sources and Jewish background was sparse. And therefore, in the commentary of the Mishnah, he includes systematic introductions to various topics, which he assumes the reader may not be familiar with. He also includes some material from philosophical sources. I'll talk to you in a minute about what that means, what significance that has. So that if you are looking in the Mishnah Torah, which is the law code, and you want some information as to where he might have sourced the laws that he put to the law code, you could go back to the commentary of the Mishnah and see how he treated the Mishnaic sources. There you may find some argumentation or some statement of preference which indicates how he arrived at the conclusion that he wrote in the Mishnah Torah. But that's only a minority of the cases, because the conclusions are not based on the Mishnah, they're based on the Talmud. Talmud postdates the Mishnah. The Babylonian Talmud was redacted 350 years after the Mishnah was created. That's where the sources for the laws are. And there he doesn't quote them, he doesn't reference them, he just simply tells you what the law is. That created an industry of people taking Maimonides' laws, going back through the Talmudic corpus, and trying to figure out what sources he had, why he chose one source or another source in order to be able to arrive at his opinion. Okay, let me just stick in at this point a little quiz on logic. Suppose we discover a contradiction between a law in Maimonides' corpus on the one hand and a statement in the Talmud on the other hand. Who wins? So you're absolutely right. Maimonides wins. Why? Why would Maimonides win?
Because he came after.
He came 700 years after the Talmud.
Which means that he
Yeah,
most likely read through all of it, or not through all of it.
He took his position knowing what is written in the Talmud. So he had some reason for taking his position in spite of the contradiction between what he said and this particular statement in the Talmud. For example, maybe there are other places in the Talmud which say differently. Or maybe when you think it's a contradiction, you don't know how he understood the statement in the Talmud. Or maybe he had a different text of the Talmud. The text of the Talmud underwent variations. There were mistakes made by copyists. At all times, there were lists of mistakes that people knew about, changes that were made. In our Talmud, there are at least 3 separate commentaries on every page talking about where there are difficulties in the text and where the text has to be amended. Often it's amended on the basis of other manuscripts, sometimes amended on the basis of logic. That happened at all stages of Jewish development, except for the Torah, which was dictated by God, but all human bodies, when they were transmitted, mistakes were made. Sometimes in the Talmud, when they're quoting a Mishnah, the response of a scholar is, that Mishnah was communicated in a confused fashion. We're not getting the original text, because what you're presenting to me is so illogical that it can't be the original text. Mishabashtahi. It's confused. The transmission was confused, and you're not getting the original text. So that happened at all times. So that's why we say Maimonides knew the entire Talmud. If he made his statement in spite of this sentence that you see here at this piece of Talmud, then he took that into account, and he took his position anyway. So if there's a contradiction, the later source always wins.
Yeah, but that's only for the Gemara. It's not for the Mishnah, right?
The Mishnah is worse because the Talmudic sages often rejected the Mishnah also. The Mishnah is not binding. The Mishnah is not binding.
It's supposed to be oral anyway.
I'm sorry, say again?
It's supposed to be oral anyway.
But that would have nothing to do with why it's binding. Whether you put pen to parchment or whether you recite it orally, the words are the same words, the proposition is the same proposition, logic is the same logic. But the Talmudic sages had the right to reject the Mishnah, and they did on many occasions. They rejected the Mishnah and they decided against the Mishnah. What you may be referring to is a slightly different proposition. There is the entire corpus of literature prior to and including the Mishnah, which includes much more than the Mishnah. And the question is whether later a scholar can go against that entire corpus, not just a particular book called the Mishnah. The Mishnah is a selection out of a much larger corpus of information.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. You can't just go against some of the oral law.
Well, okay. Now, it's interesting. Since we've gotten onto this, let me just lay the principles down. Any later generation can challenge any previous generation. Any later generation can challenge any previous generation. There's no such thing as, they said it 1,000 years ago, so it's binding. The phrase that the Talmud uses is, Ein ladayin ela masha ein avros. The judge has only what his eyes see. He only has what his eyes see. Now, there is an impression created by some passages in the Talmud that a Talmudic sage can't reject the entire corpus of the received information up to and including the Mishnah. That's called the Tannaitic period. There is such an impression. The Kesef Mishnah, Rav Yosef Karo says, that's because there was a convention. The rabbis got together and they decided not to do that. They chose voluntarily not to do that. It's a Kesef Mishnah, Hilchos Mamrin, Perek Gimel. But it's only because they decided. They didn't have to decide. There's no principle of Jewish law that requires that. Every later generation can challenge anything in any previous generation with only one exception, and that's the final decision in the Babylonian Talmud. If the Babylonian Talmud says this is the law, that's binding. But only then. Mishnah Nat, which came before, and all the later codes have their critics and disagree with the decisions. There's no other position of Jewish law, earlier or later, that has this binding nature. Why is the stated law of the Babylonian Talmud binding? For two reasons Maimonides writes in his introduction to the Mishnah. One is the Talmud was circulated to all known Jewish communities and they all accepted it. And the second was that the editors of the Babylonian Talmud, Ravina Rabashi, had a certain scholarly quality, hard to describe because the word he uses is a word which is unique, that's not used anywhere else, so it's not exactly easy to explain what he means. Baalei ha'tokol ha'atik in Hebrew means something like copy faithfully. But when you're dealing with concepts and principles and ideas and arguments, faithfulness has to be with great intellectual grasp. And they were the end of the people who had those qualities. Though those two reasons together is why, if the Talmud settles a law, that law is binding. But nothing before nor since has that quality. Yes, people are reluctant to take issue with the sages of earlier generations, usually because of their stature. I doubt if anyone in this room was taking a first year of physics and read a paper by Einstein and saw something which looked very funny, would say, "Oh, I found a mistake in Einstein." You probably wouldn't do that. You'd probably say, "Listen, Einstein was a revolving genius. It was Time Magazine's Man of the Century, that's all. And probably then there's something here that I didn't quite get." But when you are yourself a recognized scholar and you learned what the priors say and you disagree, you're always free to disagree. And so throughout Jewish history down to the present day. The Gaon of Vilna was famous for disagreeing with medieval, with Rambam, with Tosfos, with others. There's no limitation whatsoever. Each generation has to decide in terms of the logic that it understands. I learned the Daf Yomi. We're learning the Dorim now, and the Ran, the voluminous commentary, says, I went through the Rashba on this, and because I didn't understand his reason, I say differently. Not because I didn't understand his reason, so I have to submit myself to him because he's greater than I am. No, I didn't understand his reason. He didn't communicate with me. He didn't convince me. So I say differently. I have to follow what I understand. I couldn't understand him. Rabbi Meir was reputed to be one of the greatest of the Tanoim. That's a scholar up to but and including the time of the Mishnah. He was so good, the Talmud says, that if he would argue pro, everybody would say, oh, yeah, pro. He would argue con, everybody would say, oh, yeah, con. And he could play them with them like a ping pong ball. He could just push them from one side to the other. And the Talmud concludes, therefore, the law was not decided according to Rabbi Meir. Why? Because if you hear him arguing pro and you're convinced it must be pro, and then you hear him arguing con and you're convinced it must be con, you know you don't get it. You don't get him. You're not grasping him. He can argue with you either way. You're not understanding his arguments. If you're not understanding his arguments, then you can't use them. If you can't use them, he factors himself out. So you are free to decide against him. Now that doesn't mean every Tom, Dick, and Harry can decide. Back to your first year physics student. But those who are on the level of the top scholars of the generation, they go with what they can understand, and they're not bound by earlier judgments, except for when the Babylonian Talmud says that it has arrived at a legal decision. That's binding, but nothing else is binding. So that's how it works. Maimonides, if it seems like a contradiction between Maimonides and the Talmud, we follow Maimonides because he knew that statement in the Talmud. And he said, even so, I'm taking another position. Then he had a reason for taking that position. In general, we follow the later authorities for that very reason, because the later authority has in front of him all of the previous, and in light of all of the previous, he takes the position that he does. Okay, so that's something that Maimonides did. He organized the laws and laid them out. And as I said, all the laws, even the ones that aren't applicable now, but will be applicable times of the Messiah. And that was a gigantic effort. And as I said, there was opposition to the idea of just a book of laws without all the derivations and arguments. It was controversial for a while. Maimonides won the day hands down. There are hundreds of different codes. Some comprehensive codes, some codes on very narrowly defined subjects. But the idea of having a handy code which simply tells you what to do is something which became universal in Jewish literature. A revolution that he himself made. Another thing that Maimonides did, this I heard from the Rabbi. I was privileged to have a meal with him in Chicago a couple of years ago in the winter, traipsing through the snow on Shabbos. He asked the few of us who were there, what was Maimonides' greatest contribution to the Torah, to Jewish life, to Jewish thought? And we suggested various things, and he offered an idea which was very novel. None of us thought of it. And when he explained it to us, it was very impressive. He said, Maimonides made the study of the basic beliefs of Judaism a central study. You may know that in the Siddur there are the 13 principles of faith. Someday we'll talk about what faith is and isn't and so forth and so on. But there are 13 principles. To take it by Maimonides' commentary in the Mishnah. Before Maimonides, there was no such thing as a list of principles and a categorization and an attempt to define them. There was no such thing. Rabbi pointed out, in Maimonides' days, many Jews believed that God is a physical body. Maimonides mentions that. He classifies it. Others talked about it. Why did they believe that? Because the verses in the Torah, if you take them literally, do talk about God's head and God's shoulders and God's arms and God's legs, God's eyes and God's ears. If you have a certain cast of mind, which apparently was common in those times among simple people, and today it's common among people who are simple, who will think of themselves very sophisticated, that if it's physical, it's real. If it's not physical, it's not real. They're called materialists or physicalists. If it's not physical, it's not real. So to them, I have a book. This book is received by my community as a book of truth. It talks about a being called God. If I'm going to relate to it as real, I've got to relate to it as physical. Because otherwise, to me, it's just not real. It's a fantasy. By the way, in the ancient world, we were accused of being atheists because we had no pictures of God, no statues. No pictures, no statues, no form. Then you're fooling. You're just fooling. You say, believe in a being that has no physical form? That's just a joke. That's not serious. It can't be serious. Said the Novominsker Rebbe, today, you will not find a Jew on the planet who thinks that God has a body. That's been wiped out, totally wiped out. Maimonides wiped it out. Because he made the study of the principles a study. He made it a matter of discussion, a matter of investigation. And by doing that, little by little, it percolated through the people, and he simply wiped that out. The fact that there are books that talk about the principles and what the principles mean and how they're binding and everything else, Maimonides invented that as a subject. And it has had a lasting effect on the Jewish people. He also wrote a very famous book called The Guide of the Perplexed. The Guide of the Perplexed is a review of the philosophy that was in existence at his time. He treats central questions like God's being embodied. He has 50 chapters where he takes all the vocabulary that implies being embodied and shows how it should be understood so it doesn't carry that implication. He talks about the nature of prophecy. He talks about the reasons for the commandments. 1/6 of the book is reasons for the commandments, where he has reasons for almost all of them. A few, he says, I have not been able to discover the reasons for these and these commandments. He includes a description of the deepest levels of Jewish mysteries. But as he says, since you're not allowed to publicize these things, I'm going to write the mysteries in mystery. and either you'll penetrate my mystery or you won't penetrate my mystery. And it's sort of there, I've read that passage at least 2,000 times, and I don't get it. I don't get those mysteries. It's a monumental work. Now, it was written in Arabic, again, for people who had studied Arabic philosophy, and through Arabic translations, Greek philosophy. It was translated into Latin and had an effect on Christianity in Europe. Thomas Aquinas knew it and used a great deal of it. It's a landmark work in philosophy generally. Now, in the Mishnah, the commentary of the Mishnah, and in the Mishnah Torah itself, and also in the guide, he says the following thing. I often quote ideas from other books. Jewish scholars and non-Jewish scholars. Sometimes I identify the authors and sometimes I don't. The reason is this. First of all, if I identify an author, the reader may have prejudices against him. And he may reject what the author says just because it comes from that author. And I don't want the principle, I don't want the statement to be rejected just because the reader is prejudiced against the author. Accept the truth from whoever says it. You shouldn't have prejudices like that. Number one. And number two, he says, all of the material that I quote from other authors, I verified myself. I don't rely on them as authorities. I don't believe it because so-and-so said so. That's the opposite of prejudice. It's the opposite but parallel prejudice. Prejudice means I don't believe it because he said so. And the opposite is to say I believe it because he said so. Both of them are prejudiced. Maimonides said, think it out for yourself. I thought them out for myself. When I write it, I'm taking responsibility for it. This is very important because since there are some overlaps between what Maimonides wrote and what Aristotle wrote, you will read in irresponsible authors that Maimonides was an Aristotelian. That is the furthest thing from the truth. The furthest thing from the truth. Number one, he didn't recognize Aristotle as authority. There's only one authority, and that's the Jewish tradition. The Tanakh, the written Torah, the oral Torah, that's the only authority that Maimonides recognized. Indeed, several times in the guide, he says, I'm going to tell you what Aristotle said. Then I'll show you what's in the verses of the prophets and the Torah. I'll show you what's in the oral tradition so we can see what parts of Aristotle we can accept and what parts of Aristotle we have to reject. He says that word for word. Now, I must tell you, I had a very, very pleasant discovery. There is an encyclopedia online called the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It is very, very good. They pick top people for each subject. If you want a review of a philosophical subject, of course, it's written for philosophers, so sometimes there's technical terms, but it's extremely well organized and extremely well researched. And they have an article on Maimonides. And the author of Maimonides, of the article is a recognized scholar in the academic world. He's written books on Maimonides. He edited the Cambridge Companion to Maimonides. He's not Orthodox. He's not Orthodox. So I thought to myself, wow, what is he going to say? What is he going to say? Kenneth Seeskin at Northwestern University. I was overjoyed where he says Maimonides was not an Aristotelian. So somebody out there in the academic world is getting it. I was overjoyed to see that. I got a book of his called Maimonides and the Creation of the World. It's a very good book. I don't agree with everything in it, but it's a very good book. And he gives the answer to the standard academic mistakes that are typical and common. It's also published by Cambridge University Press. I mean, he's a top scholar. So Maimonides says explicitly, the only authority I accept is the authority of Torah. And that being the case, if someone preaches or codifies or asserts, I measure it against Torah. If it fits Torah, then it's acceptable. Doesn't fit Torah, it's not acceptable. Somebody might think up something I didn't think of. That could happen. But whether it's correct or not is not determined by who said it. Prejudice is to say, I reject it because so-and-so said it. The opposite, which is also bad, is to say, I accept it because so-and-so said it. You have to be able to evaluate it on your own and on the basis of the body of truth that you start with. And of course, Maimonides starts with the Torah as his body of truth. Now, Maimonides' attitude towards the Talmud is exactly the same way. He accepts anything that is a Talmudic decision. But not everything written in the Talmud is a Talmudic decision. For example, you may have heard the idea that our phase of history, our phase of the world, up to the coming of the Messiah, has a limit of 6,000 years. Maimonides rejects that. He rejects it explicitly. It's a statement in the Talmud, and he rejects it. Says Maimonides, yes, but it's a statement of an individual in the Talmud. Statement of an individual. Statement of an individual is not binding. When the Talmud says the magic word hilchasa, hilchasa means that's the law, then it's binding. The statement of a Talmudic opinion, an individual Talmudic opinion, is not binding. And therefore, he rejected it. And the Rabbi followed him in rejecting it, so much so that Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, who lived in the United States and died about 10 years ago, no more, 15 years ago, 20, told his students that if our phase of history goes on beyond the year 6,000, that's not a disproof of Judaism. If you have two people like Maimonides and Rabbi, both of whom say that 6,000 is not binding, you cannot call the 6,000 an article of faith in the Jewish religion. The fact that one Talmudic sage said so does not mean that it's binding on later generations. So, Maimonides will take the Talmud and use its own principles of what's binding and what isn't to determine what he takes from the Talmud and what he doesn't. Yeah.
What if it's more than one person that holds the? I guess it's going to happen in by 6,000 years. What if it's a bunch of people, but it's not necessarily a hilko?
You'd have to know what the others held. And it's very interesting. The Talmud often quotes an opinion, and it says, this opinion was held by the following string of people. And it goes to prove that they all held this opinion, right? The general attitude towards such a statement is, and therefore the law is not like that. The list of the exceptions. Here are the exceptions. All 5 of these are exceptions, but they're all exceptions. And the law is not like that. So you have to know there are hundreds of sages quoted in the Talmud. The fact that you have 5 doesn't tell you much. That's why if it doesn't say hilchasa, and then there's no way to say that it's binding. You can have disagreements about how to handle it, but no way to say that it's absolutely binding. Maimonides does that in a number of cases. Now there is a idea that was expressed by a certain rabbi in the 1970s, and it became very popular in certain circles. And this is the last thing I want to tell you today. What does Jewish law cover? What are its subjects? What is its extent? In particular, does Jewish law cover belief, matters of philosophy, abstract understanding, or is Jewish law simply what you have to do? Putting on tefillin in the morning, keeping kosher, praying. Does Jewish law extend into the area of what's called philosophy? Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan gave an address, and it was published as an article, in which he said there's no Jewish law about philosophy, philosophical issues. No Jewish law. No binding decision. And therefore, everyone is free to take any position that he wants. He cited 3 places where Maimonides says, in the commentary of the Mishnah, and in his book, which goes through the 613 commandments, both early works of Maimonides, where he says that I'm not going to settle this issue because it has no practical effect. Now, these works are written in Arabic, so we're at the mercy of translators. Is that exactly what it says and exactly what it means? In one place he says, I don't have to. In one place he says, there is no decision. In another place he says, I'm not going to decide. It's hard to know because it's medieval philosophic Arabic. So it's very hard to get clear on nuances like that. At any rate, so he quotes these places where Maimonides says this. He said, look, Maimonides. Who's bigger than Maimonides? Maimonides says there are no decisions in areas where there's no practical effect. And therefore, everybody's free to believe what he pleases. Rabbi Moshe Meiselman was a contemporary, friend of mine, teacher of mine, put out a book 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, called Torah, Chazal, and Science, 900 pages worth. And he covers a vast, vast ground of issues relevant to science in general. And he has a couple of chapters on this subject, and he demonstrates that this position is incorrect. First of all, 2 out of the places which Rabbi Kaplan chose, Maimonides says, no decision because it's not practical. In the Mishnah Torah, which came later, he decided them. He himself decided them. So what could he have meant? Could he have meant no decision because it's impossible? No decision because there's no truth? No decision because it's beyond our ability? Then how did he himself give answers in a later work? How did he do that? Did he change his mind? In the Ma'amar Altura Mesim, the essay on the resurrection, which he wrote at the end of his life, he quotes what he says in the commentary of the Mishnah and what he says in the Mishnah Torah and reaffirms it at the end of his life. So apparently he didn't change his mind. So what did he mean? Furthermore, there are statements in the Talmud which are clearly statements of what you would call philosophy. This world will last for 6,000 years or not. What am I supposed to do about that? Put on tefillin on Fridays or not? Keep kosher or not? Well, how's that going to affect what I do? Not going to affect what I do at all. Yet Maimonides treated that statement of the Talmud as a matter that he had to deal with, and he dealt with it in the way you deal with laws. It's majority against minority. It's a minority opinion. It doesn't bind me. He didn't say, it's philosophy. I don't care what they said. I can think whatever I want. He didn't do that. Furthermore, there are statements in the Talmud that deal with clearly philosophical issues. Here's one. The Talmud records a debate between the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai. Was man's creation noach lo? Noach lo in Hebrew is hard to translate. Pleasant, appropriate, successful, valuable, valid, successful. Was man's creation good or not? They debated it for 2.5 years. You can imagine which side took which position. Beis Hillel said that it was good. Beis Shammai said it was no good. And after 2.5 years, Beis Hillel caved in and said, we give up, you're right. Now, whatever this means, this is not, how many minutes after sundown must I wait before the Shabbos is over, and, can I eat milk after meat 5 hours later or 6 hours later? This is not a practical matter. This is certainly a philosophical matter. What was it about? Well, since the Torah says at the end of the creation that God saw everything that he did, it was very good, it couldn't really be about whether or not the creation was good. Of course the creation was good. It says so in the Torah. No, what they were discussing, according to Mr. Salanter, what they were discussing was, can we see that it's good or not? We look at the Torah, we look at what the Torah wants, we look at people's lives. Can we see that people's lives are successful, or can we not? And as a matter of fact, there's a responsibility to investigate. When we are told things by tradition, whether it's in the Torah or in the oral tradition, there is a responsibility to investigate to see if we could understand it on our own. Of course, if we don't understand it, that doesn't mean it isn't true. The question is, we're supposed to exercise our knowledge, our understanding, to try to understand it on our own. So that's what they tried to do for 2.5 years. And in the end, they decided, Beis Hillel caved in, which they did very often. In controversies between Hillel and Shammai, house of Hillel and house of Shammai, very often Beis Hillel changed their minds in the end and came to agree with Beis Shammai, the vast majority of the time. A few times Beis Shammai changed their minds, but most of the time Beis Hillel changed their minds. And they said, now that we can't see how to deal with it, so a person should try to do the best that he can. We can't see the success that it carries. So this is a case where the Talmud is discussing a philosophical issue and concludes on the basis of a vote that this is what the law is. Yeah.
Who said 6,000 years initially? Like, Because I always believed that was set in stone. Like, who was the first person that said that? Did it not come from Sinai orally?
No, it's a statement in the Talmud. The Talmud wasn't given at Sinai.
I thought the oral law was passed down in the...
Oh, well, the oral law and the Talmud are not the same thing.
Not the same.
No,
Okay.
there was an oral law that was given to Moses at Sinai. That's true, but there were many, many additions later. All the rabbinic laws, which are part of the oral law, were made later.
So how did they derive 6,000? How could someone initially come up with such a binding statement that could risk losing the faith? Like, if they got to the year 6010, like, people
Yeah.
would have started to panic, and there would have been people that happened.
But that's not a reason not to state what you believe to be true. If we adopted that kind of reasoning, then you would be justified in questioning everything you read. We'll hide that from the public, because if they hear that, maybe under certain circumstances their faith is going to be shaken and so forth and so on. Then you never know what is true. We don't play that game.
But where could somebody have got 6,000 from?
From certain verses interpreted the way he interpreted them, and it says a day in God, 1,000 years is a day in God's sight. There were 6 days of creation, so 1,000 years corresponding to each of the 6 days of creation, and it goes on like that. And the truth is, the Kabbalistic sources use this very greatly. Although the Talmud doesn't directly quote Kabbalistic sources, question of how much was common knowledge at that time. But Maimonides has a position that since the state in the Talmud is recorded, it's a statement of an individual. It's not binding. It's not binding. That's the way you. So then it means that matters of philosophy also are up for the same methodology that you'd use to decide what's kosher and what's treif, how long Shabbos is, what you can do on holidays. It's the same procedure. After all, as we said 25 minutes ago, that's a joke. I don't know whether it was 25 or 27. Maimonides instituted the study of fundamental principles of belief. Some of those fundamental principles of belief are matters that you could call broadly philosophical. Reward and punishment. Reward and punishment doesn't determine what's kosher and what's treif, but it's a fundamental principle. It's one of the things which, if a Jew doesn't believe, then there's something seriously amiss, something seriously wrong. Isn't that philosophical? So if we definitely have commandments of belief, how could it be that there's no discussion about how those commandments should be implemented, what they contain, what they don't contain, how they should be defined? Of course they're contained. Of course they're defined. So this applies. Now, in the laws of repentance, Maimonides discusses as tshuva. As I said, repentance is not quite the right translation. Laws of tshuva is centrally about how do you respond to mistakes that you've made? What do you do to repair? But because it talks about mistakes and responsibility for mistakes, it has a whole discussion of free will. What is free will? Why is it important? When does it apply? How do we answer challenges against free will? It has a discussion of the world to come. Reward and punishment. What is the ultimate reward? What is it like? He has discussion of how one should serve God. What is the ideal way to serve God? Ideal motivation psychologically to have for serving God out of love, serving God without the hope of reward, though the reward is promised, but that shouldn't be the motivation, how that's possible psychologically. All of this and more is included in the laws of tshuva that we are going to study. I've taken a translation from the net. Chabad has a reasonably good translation. I've changed it in certain ways. I'm putting the changes in my own bracket, so you'll see which is which. And we'll discuss it. I'm going to start with chapter 2, because chapter 2 is more focused on the definition of tshuva. And then we'll move both backwards and forwards from there to cover the text as best we can. Okay? So we'll pick up tomorrow in the session.
Thank you.